Policy Institute senior fellow. He is chairman of the China Policy Initiative. Steve Yates. Steve, it's great to see you this morning. Thanks very much. Oh, this is rich with China backing Russia and accusing the West of making up stories and politicizing this. Your thoughts on where we are first with this standoff between Russia and Ukraine? The U.S. says Russia is lying about pulling back troops.
Yeah, well, it is rich to hear the possibly largest giver of disinformation into the world critique others on disinformation.
Exactly.
But I think we're in a very troubling position with regard to the standoff between sort of the State Department spokesman and President Biden versus leaders in Ukraine and what the rest of the world can kind of see with their own eyes and hear with their own ears. We don't get the luxury of knowing exactly what Vladimir Putin is going to do, and it's certainly not just happy talk between him and the Ukraine. But what we see, I think, is some provocative weakness. And where China gains advantage, they like seeing American allies in disarray and seeing NATO play a largely marginalized role in this situation. Europe generally not providing very much deterrence, and the United States saying there's going to be an invasion on Wednesday, and then Wednesday comes and goes. For them, it says, can they have a minor incursion against Taiwan where there'll be minimal impact? And so it raises a lot of parallel questions that are at least troubling and possibly worse with regard to other interests.
Yeah, and look, Steve, I still question whether or not this was a situation of trying to change the subject, because on Friday you had Jake Sullivan, who we know was one of the pushers of the Russia-Trump collusion lie early on, working for Hillary Clinton. And now, those who abused power are now in power. And you had Jake Sullivan on Friday hyping up the fact that Russia would invade on Wednesday. Wednesday came and went. But the broader issue of China partnering with Russia, what kind of a threat does that represent to you? Because the Biden administration now is criticizing China, saying it's failing to uphold a range of trade commitments. Who ever expected the CCP to uphold any promises anyway? But the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative says that Beijing has not met its promises when it joined the World Trade Organization. Others made in the Phase 1 deal signed under the Trump administration. Steve, this whole idea that the CCP is going to, keep its promises, we've seen this movie before. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, you're very true. I mean, there's been multiple times where American leaders have placed what we a lot of times call a bet. They bet on the Chinese being helpful in balancing against the Soviet Union, and you can assess whether that was really vital or not. Perhaps there's a case to be made. There was a bet placed in 2000, 2001 that bringing China into the WTO would normalize China, and I think what it's really done is neutralized the WTO. And so I think the sin is not in placing the bet. We can argue pros or cons on that based on what we knew at the time, but the sin is in ignoring the evidence of a consistent pattern of behavior. Senator Rick Scott of Florida has proposed in the wake of this kind of 20-year evidence on the WTO that we should withdraw China's permanent normal trade relations status. It's certainly something that should be discussed and debated. I think it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, look, what are your thoughts on the significance of the China-Russia partnership as we watch China rise, continuing to want to overtake the United States as the number one superpower, finding a friend in Russia?
Well, I see it as an axis of annoyance more than a true axis with coordinated powers and common interests. I mean, their common interests are frustrating the United States, disaggregating our allies, seeking advantage where they can. And I think we can't be flippant about what they can do together because it's easier to break things and frustrate things than it is to solve problems. And so the United States is usually about trying to solve problems when we're under good leadership. And so they don't have to become a powerful alliance to match us. They can simply get in our way, and especially when we're distracted at home, they can cause a lot of damage.
So what about all of this bullying of Taiwan? So Taiwan leadership now says that a Chinese civilian plane that flew near one of its remote islands earlier this month could have been a test of its military response. Steve, your thoughts on what the CCP is planning or thinking with all of these military jets flying into Taiwan's defense space?
They certainly have increased the pace of coercion and limits testing. Yeah. They've gone into the air defense identification zone multiple times in multiple ways. And so they're clearly pushing and testing. The question is whether they're getting any kind of a signal back the other way that this is an unfruitful investment on their part and that they might face grave consequences that they dare not if they were to go further. The weakness that we have shown with regard to the situation with the Ukraine is deeply troubling, but also pulling back from what had been a favorable trend in diplomacy in the Middle East raises questions. And so I think it's very, very key for the Biden administration, the United States, at the very least, to protect our supply chain, which depends on Taiwan for semiconductors and many other things. We can't play around with that. It's so central to America's way of life.
That's a great point. So what should Joe Biden be doing? I mean, he hasn't even brought up the origins of COVID-19 to Xi Jinping.
Yeah, well, I lament the fact that I have no confidence that President Biden is going to do the right thing or is inclined to do so or even able to articulate what America's approach is to China. But in a sane world, we would have a president who's speaking very clearly to the American people to prepare them for the challenge we face and help marshal those forces. I think we have to wait for another election cycle for that.
Wow. Steve, it's great to get your insights as always. Good to see you, sir.